All right. Hey, folks. Today we're going to talk about RIR and RPE. Now, I want you guys to go away with an understanding of the role of RIR and RPE in the history of physique sports. So let's get started. Now, in the early days of the internet, there wasn't a great deal of discussion around keeping a couple of reps in the tank. It just wasn't something that was talked about very much. It was a fairly alien concept in writing. The introduction of the internet to society has been fascinating to watch because in the early days, the first sort of 5 years of the internet, as it started to become more and more in popular use, there was really an explosion of content. However, that content was really quite raw and it lacked nuance. And in one of those fields, particularly the field of physique and fitness, the writing was really very amateur. And so in the early days, those early writers were really just doing their best to communicate sets and reps. The sets and reps were just simply done. There wasn't really a great deal of discussion about the complexities and the nuance of those sets and reps that were listed. So, for example, a lot of writers would not even really distinguish between warm-up sets and working sets. So 5x5, there were early internet arguments about 5x5 routines, like, were they supposed to be all working sets, or were they supposed to be ramping sets? And that was actually a talking point. There was such a lack of clarity that in some cases, articles were written where it was said you do 5x5, and the reality was that actually only one of those sets was a working set. And the writer knew that. It's just that that's the way things were communicated. There was no standard for communication. Everybody was just trying to do a good job of putting out content. So the nuance of reps in reserve or rate of perceived exertion was just not communicable back then. There was no standard language for those terms. So in the beginning, it was simply do the work. And as with bodybuilding culture being bodybuilding culture and strongman and powerlifting to a lesser extent, it was more about just working hard. That was what the early days taught you. Work hard. And then we didn't have a great deal of nuance surrounding how to perform these routines. There was no real discussion about light days and light reps and warm-up reps and sets which weren't to be taken to failure. It was just sets and reps and things were just listed. That was the majority of what we saw. And a lot of you guys won't remember those days because you really got onto the internet maybe 2005, 2010. And by that time, things had moved on. But that's at least how things started. There wasn't a great deal of nuance. And in some circles, there still isn't. However, that was not the case over the sports themselves. So I can remember lifting in the early 2000s, and people who I talked to, one of my first powerlifting coaches was a high frequency coach. He would squat, bench, and deadlift Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and his entire crew would do that. And they all got ridiculously strong. He had some crazy strong guys under his charge. Those guys it was all acknowledged that they weren't training to the max. None of them were trained to failure. And he communicated that to the people when he trained with them. It was more about the perfection of the reps. So it was essentially a modern day Shaco style of thing, you know? And it was just, you were supposed to go in, do the work. You weren't supposed to strain. You were supposed to perfect your form. And slowly over time, your minimum amount that you could do would just increase. And it's easy to communicate that in person. But people weren't really writing about that so much. The common sort of thing was to write sets and reps and just go hard. So the message you got as a young YOLO going onto the internet in those days was just, great, I'm going to do this routine, I'm going to do Arnold's routine, and I'm going to do everything to failure and beyond. And then people would sit back and blame Arnold or whatever, right? But there was a lot of nuance in person. So the concept of not going all out all the time is entrenched in our sports. It's just, it lost a lot going onto the internet. The other example I've got is in bodybuilding. In some circles, it was generally acknowledged that you didn't go to failure, you didn't train all the way. And you also didn't go particularly heavy either. So you kept in that sort of moderate rep range, and you just made sure the stress was placed on the muscle. And we know now that's actually very sensible from modern EMG studies. We know that depending on the load, the prime driver will take more or less of the stress. So like the bench press and the squat, for example, keeping the load relatively moderate activates the chest more actually. Whereas under maximal loads, the triceps are brought into play more. So those guys knew this, and guys like Lee Haney were always saying, you know, stimulate, don't annihilate. So they were trying to communicate this concept of keeping a few reps in the tank, not going all out. So the concept is entrenched in our whole physique sphere. It's just not been communicated very well. And that's kind of the point of this video. So the written word lacked a common language. So no one was really talking about RIR or RPE. No one was really writing about it. So the assumption was, to the average Joe just looking to go online who hadn't really discussed things with the powerlifters in his gym, just go train hard. If you went online and looked at what was up there, or if you read magazines, it was just, hey, go do this, train as hard as you can. There wasn't really talk about that. And I think, just from my own perspective, nostalgia in older lifters and the whole like, it wasn't like that back in my day type of vibe. You young guys know what I'm talking about. That whole vibe of some older lifters, they look back with rose-tinted glasses and think, yeah, we all just wanted to work hard. Well, yeah, we did, and a lot of guys do now as well. But there was also a lot of coasting too. There was a lot of taking some sessions easy. Like, there was a lot of that, and it's entrenched in our sports way back to the old Soviet days in the 60s, where the weightlifters would take easy days and light days, and it wasn't always done to a max. So in both cases, what was not easily communicated was the intent. So in powerlifting, the intent was the perfection of the rep. In bodybuilding, it was the stress on the muscle. These sets and reps were just a tool to accomplish that, and it wasn't a goal in and of itself. But we lost that nuance going onto the internet via the written word. We lost all that. But it's always been in our sports. So roughly sometime in the mid-2000s, enter Mike T. RPE, so his rate of perceived exertion scale, was the first example of somebody actually trying to assign a formal language and attempting to bridge the gap between what good coaches were doing in the gym to what was on the internet. Mike T was the first one to bridge that language gap and actually assign some universal language for everyone to adhere to. And it was massively popular. It was insane. It blew up overnight. And you had people who were on both sides of the fence. Some people thought he was just a genius and he was amazing and really understood what he was trying to do. He was trying to provide some clarity for the nuance of hard training. Other people thought that he was just using it as an excuse not to train hard and was trying to communicate that to other people. Seriously. And I think people still do. There are still coaches out there who almost get mad at the idea of RPE, RIR, or taking deloads, which is, I won't say it's stupid, but it's ignorance. It's ignorant because it is a part of our sports. It is a part of human development. Like, there are times when we go a bit easier, when we go a bit harder. There are times where we deload. It's just the way it is. So just denying that, I think, is not realistic. And I think it's probably a throwback to the old days of saying, oh, we train harder back in my day, kids these days, you know, those kind of nonsense. But anyway, Mike T, the reason that he came up with this, Mike T is famous for his whole emerging strategies type of approach. Now, just briefly, that is a bottom-up style of approach of periodization. So essentially what he does, for those of you who don't know, he starts every trainee off like a blank slate. And he puts them on a routine where he'll evaluate them in the first block and then base their periodization off that. So he'll look at their volume totals, how they adopt things, how they respond to things, and he will literally base their entire progression off that. Now, the opposite to that is what was more easily communicated in the internet days, in the pre-internet days, via books from the Soviet models, like from Tudor Bomper, which was the top-down periodization. Like the classic microcycle, macrocycle, yearly cycle periodization model type of thing, the whole accumulation phases, realization phases, all of that is very easy to communicate because you can use it on a whole bunch of people to say, this is the way your training is going to be for the next year, for the next 5 years, usually the next 4 years between every Olympics. So Mike T was trying to communicate this more nuanced approach. Now, the reality is that even the old Soviet coaches would do a bit of both. Okay, you would do a top-down approach and you would fill in with bottom-up approaches. So you would take the individual into account And I would say most evidence-based coaches or most modern coaches are going to listen to their athletes as well as have an overarching idea of what their training style is. And you probably get that if you go online or any of the people that you follow. You'll get a flavor for what their general style of coaching is. But if they're good coaches, they'll also listen to the client. And that's when you get the marriage of a good coach, who they understand what their method is, but they also listen to the client and they marry the two. All Mike T was trying to do with the RPE scale, he was trying to provide a language to use between coach and client to evaluate the client and their input to the periodization problem. Because up until that point, there wasn't really a common language. So anytime somebody was going online and trying to learn more about lifting, it was just, here you sets and reps, work hard, go away. There wasn't anything else. And that's what he was trying to accomplish. So the reality is, in practice, we did everything. We did that. In practice, we listened to our bodies, but we also followed plans. In practice, we sometimes went to failure, sometimes we didn't. In practice, we had heavy periods of time, we had lighter periods, we had some low volume phases, we had some high volume phases. In practice, all of those things were done. And I think if the internet has done anything, it's made people jump into sort of camps. And when people jump into camps, then they get zealous about things, and they start to not consider the other side of the coin. So we need people to assign a common language to these terms, like RPE, RIR, all that kind of stuff. Like Mike Israetel did with the whole MRV, MEV, stimulus to fatigue ratio, and Greg Nuckols did with hard sets. So before Greg Nuckols had said, look, we are going to count volume in bodybuilding with a number of hard sets, people are using things like tonnage, and tonnage has a ton of problems with it. So, I mean, how do you compare the tonnage of a squat with the tonnage of a leg press? You can't. It's insane. So what these people have done is, and including Mike T, what they've done is they've allowed the rest of us to talk in common about these common concepts. So we can now discuss the top end of work we can do per week, and we know that's MRV. We can discuss the volume per week. We know it's hard sets per week. We know these things. And even as we speak, there are people like Peter Beardsley who are trying to make those concepts even more nuanced and look at things like effective reps, which provide even more clarity for us as we move on. When we can talk about these things, we can apply them to appropriate audiences. Like, I imagine a situation where 20 years from now, we are even further along in our ability to communicate. And in doing so, we'll be even further along in terms of how many people around the world can enter into this discussion and how good we can get in our training practices. Our training practices have improved dramatically over the last 20 years, especially for bodybuilding, There are more people who are bigger and are injury-free now than there were 20 years ago, for sure. It's because partly the explosion of the sports, but also partly our ability to communicate things has massively improved. We make mistakes. We go down a few rabbit holes, sure. The whole if fit your macros rabbit hole, we went down that massively. And we've now learned from that, and now we're in a more of a balanced place. But we also learned from the Tupperware days where we would go around with plastic containers. All the time, our communication is getting better. And as communication gets better, more people get entered into discussion, and that will benefit all of us eventually. But we need a common language, and Mike T really kicked that off. The modern situation right now is that with all training and diet zealotry, people jump into camps. People who lack the sort of critical thinking will just jump into a camp. You get your hard-nosed coaches who want everything to failure, and hard work is everything, right? Then you get your sort of pseudo-intelligent coaches who are usually fresh out of university, and they say that everyone must train with RIR and RPE. It's what blows my mind, actually, is that some beginner trainers, some beginner lifters, a guy who's the first time he stepped foot into the gym, his first exposure to training talk is RIR and RPE. And as a beginner, he's already thinking about RIR and RPE. I mean, that's crazy to me. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Both of these types of coaches, the everything to failure or everyone uses RIR, both of them are just expressing their frustrations at the other side. So the hard-nosed coach is like, you guys are training like pansies. You've got to go hard all the time. The pseudo-intelligent coach goes, oh, you don't know anything. Like, you've got to train with RIR. And he says even the beginner's got to train with RIR. Both of them just lack the critical thinking necessary to understand that we do both. We need both at appropriate times. And I happen to think the really good coaches, even the hard-nosed coaches who are good at what they do, they probably communicate to their clients to do a bit of both. It's just that they don't tend to speak in those terms because of their personal frustrations at the other side. But anyway, I don't know. So, essentially, for yourself, take-home messages for you guys. Don't get it twisted. As in, don't let yourself get caught up in these camps. Okay. Don't align yourself to the whole I'm the failure guy, I'm the not failure guy, I'm the RPE guy, I'm the RIR guy. Remain flexible. Okay. Remain fluid. I personally feel that RIR and RPE are a natural extension of the language we use to discuss how hard we work. That's what I feel. I don't necessarily feel, and I'm not saying that, staying 2 RIR or 3 RIR is the best thing to do. All I'm saying is that it's language which allows us to discuss these concepts, which is important, because the more we can discuss them, the more we can come to a better understanding. And at the end of the day, the understanding might be actually 2 RIR, 3 RIR is nonsense, go to failure. But at least we can be discussing those things and test them under appropriate circumstances. So if you are sat there after this 16-minute video thinking, well, what do I actually do? My advice is try to work within the context of an overarching plan. Okay, a plan should have some periods where you're going a little bit lighter and building momentum, and it should be the majority of which you're training very, very hard. And of course, if you're training extremely hard, you're probably going to be able to do less overall work, relatively speaking, for you as an individual. If you're not training quite as hard, then you can probably get away with a little bit more. But if you're really not training very hard, then you're probably not going to get many results. In general, I think for the majority of the time, it's better to err on the side of going harder for an activity like this. And if you feel like you're still lost with all this, then I think it's probably time for a coach and to clarify these things for you and provide you with direction on how to do these things. But that was sort of the discussion for today, as I just don't like to see people get into camps saying, I believe in RIR, I believe in RPE, or I'm the failure guy and everyone else is a pansy. It's not healthy. It's not healthy for you as an individual. You should be able to think with more nuance and understand that iron culture, so our physique and strength history, encompasses all of those things, all of them. There is no train hard all the time, go hard. That's what it was like in my day. BS. That's what it was like back in your day. I was there back in your day. It wasn't like that. There was plenty of people not going quite as hard. You understood the nuance and you understood there was a time and a place for certain things. Use these concepts as means to communicate how hard to train, and it will change over time. There are nuances. Even for the most hardened, high-intensity training aficionados, there are times when you go a little bit easier to build some momentum as part of an overall plan, for example. So this is hopefully something to give you guys a bit of clarity around training and what these terms mean. And actually, they're nothing to be afraid of. They are valuable, insightful ways to communicate concepts. They're not always going to be appropriate for everyone all the time, but I think most people will be able to utilize those and think about them critically. Right, folks, hopefully that was interesting. I'll leave it there. And the subscribe button is open for today, but only for those people who utilize an RIR or RPE scale as a regular part of their training.